These days, work is in trouble. We've outsourced most of our manufacturing to other countries, and with that, we sent away good jobs and our capability to make things. American Giant is a clothing company that's pushing back against this tide. They make all kinds of high-quality clothing and activewear, like sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more, right here in the USA. So when you buy American Giant, you create jobs in towns and cities across the country. And jobs bring pride, purpose. They stitch people together. If all that sounds good to you, visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com with promo code STAPLE20.
Hello listeners and welcome to Season 3 of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host Kacey and I wanted to update this introduction to offer a few additional trigger warnings about upcoming content. As you likely know, this is a podcast about cults, extremism, coercive control, and abuses of all types. A platform for survivors and victims to share their experiences, change misconceptions, and help advocate for and educate others. Given the recent election results in America and the nature of upcoming interview themes, I wanted to remind listeners that each episode comes with a content warning for themes of murder, abuse and harm, and abortion rights and restrictions. Please take care when listening to each installment. Self-care practices may include being outside for walks or gardening or leaning into friends and family and loved ones, or participating in an activity that brings you joy like a trip to the cinema or exercise or taking a nap. Whatever self-care looks like to you, be sure to practice these things when listening to this material and any other material like this. For early access to ad-free episodes, you can find me on patreon.com/thecultvault for as little as £1 a month. Thank you so much for my patrons for being such a beacon of support, and I look forward to our monthly video call catch-ups at the end of each month. Lastly, I'm so very excited for my favourite weekend of the year in June 2025, CrimeCon UK in London on the 7th and 8th of June. Partnered with True Crime, this is going to be the biggest and busiest and best CrimeCon UK to date, with expert speakers, survivors and advocates of justice taking to the stage to discuss their work in the field of true crime. It's the UK's biggest true crime event, and it's jam-packed with talks and events throughout the weekend, with the most flexible ticket options available, including day tickets, night tickets, weekend tickets, concessions and different options for payment plans available now at crimecon.co.uk. I will be at the event. I'm so glad that I've been invited back again, and hopefully you will see me up on the big stage. And I look forward to seeing you all there. Head to crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, at the checkout for 10% off your tickets. And patrons, you can contact me for an additional reduction in ticket prices. Now, on to today's show. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and today I am joined with a new guest that is going to be talking to us about a very important subject matter, not only to this podcast, but I think to environments and cultures all around the world. I am excited to bring to the podcast today Remy. Hi, Remy.
How you doing, Kacey? Good to be here.
Would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
I can do that. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, so USA. I've been a pastor for about 30 years. I'm no longer a pastor. I started a church about 20 years ago, and I left that church about 4 years ago now into semi-retirement. And in my retirement, so to speak, I now continue to write. I've written a number of books, most of those books having to do with overcoming different things. I worked just on the side. I worked in an addiction treatment center for many years, 25 years. And out of that came a number of books trying to help people from a spiritual perspective to overcome things like shame and anger and loss and things like that. So I continue to write, and I also speak. I've developed some relationships in other countries, in Mexico and Chile and Peru. And so now I am traveling quite a bit to go into those churches and to speak as well.
I bet you've seen some pretty incredible sights traveling to those parts of the world.
I have.
So you have written a number of books on helping people, one of which is called Broken Trust. which is slightly different than some of the work around the addiction treatment center. Although you talked about anger and loss and those types of themes, I feel like they're probably still relevant in this other book, Broken Trust.
Yeah, they all go together. The Broken Trust was kind of an add-on book for me. I thought I was kind of done writing books, and then we'll probably talk about this in a minute. Then I realized I probably needed to write one more. But as I wrote about Broken Trust, as I wrote about spiritual abuse, I realized that there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of shame, which are what my two other books are about, and loss, which is another book. And that all goes together to help people to recover from their spiritual abuse situation.
Now, can you share with us what inspired you to transition from pastoring churches to writing Broken Trust?
Yeah. Well, actually, I wrote Broken Trust while I was still a pastor. So it's about, I think it's coming up on 10 years ago now. There was a church down the road from where my church was. In fact, it was the church that helped me start the church that I started in my town. And so I had some connection to that church. And when my church started and they helped me, there's a really good pastor there, and he was a good friend of mine. And then he left and another man came in. And at first he was all right. He had a good resume and all. But he started to teach a very strange teaching. It's so strange that I don't even know if I can explain it. But basically, he was encouraging people first to recover from all of their past hurts, which is a good thing. But then somehow in his recovery model, he wanted you to bond with another person in the church. And sometimes these bondings were male and female and even across marriages. And then over time, he encouraged people to separate from their families if their families couldn't support the church. And so it all got very dark. And as I saw this happening, the church came to the brink of destruction, really. And I wanted to somehow help them since I had some relationship with them. I didn't quite know how to do it, but I did have a website. And so I started writing blog posts about how to deal with this spiritually abusive situation, which I'd never done before, but there were some steps that just kind of came into my mind that I thought could help them. And they did read them, and many people thanked me for them. But what I soon found out on my blog was that people around the world were reading these blog posts about how to overcome toxic faith and spiritual abuse. And I went, oh my gosh, I had no idea. In fact, they put all my other blog posts to shame because they're just being read all the time. And so I thought, oh, maybe I have to write another book. And they say, oh no, because writing a book is hard and it takes a lot of time. And especially with spiritual abuse 10 years ago, I didn't know if anyone would even read a book on spiritual abuse. So I went on to Amazon and I checked out the other books on spiritual abuse, and there was just a handful of them. And no, they weren't being read. And I thought, shoot, I don't know if I should invest my time in writing a book and no one's going to read. But I kept hearing back from so many people that were hurting. And I thought, even if it's just read by a handful of people, I got to write this book. So that's how the book came about.
It's the story that you described in some of your writing to me about this church that helped to start your church that you used to pastor for. It's like a wild story to read on paper, but it is also familiar in a strange way. So I think to me it's familiar just through the amount of people that I've spoken with on this show in regards to spiritual abuse and religious trauma. And I'm not surprised that so many people resonated with your writing, because we have this terminology now for things like spiritual abuse that we didn't have, years back. And you said that your blog posts were really popular. Was it just with this church group that you set out to help, or was it people all around the world that were coming and reading these blog posts?
But no, it was people from around the world. And so then I put out an article on my blog saying, I think I'm going to write a book. If any of you would like to share your stories with me, I'll use it as a resource, and I might even use it in the book itself. And so then I got a lot of stories that came in, which is very helpful for me, and I put a lot of those stories in the book, which has now been very helpful to readers.
Any responses from people practicing under a different major religion, or was it all Christianity?
Mostly Christianity. People like some of the side groups like Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons and so forth, but kind of the Christian version. It was interesting for me because one woman who was a Jehovah's Witness, I asked her to read the book before I published it. And she read it through. She said, Remy, this is super helpful. I really resonated with it, but you often referred to pastors and churches. And because of that, I think people, especially Jehovah's Witnesses, they won't really resonate with that. She said, if there's any way you could rewrite the book and make it more neutral so it would apply to more people in different groups, that would be helpful. And I thought, rewrite the book, changing all those terms. So I wasn't real excited about it, but I thought, she's right. If that would help reach more people, I'll do it. So I do sometimes refer to pastors, but I'll often refer to a leader or a minister or some kind of a neutral term. So it's more applicable to different religions.
Wow. That's so amazing for her. I imagine that you took that feedback on board. Sometimes people will drop an email saying, when you say this or when you say that, it could be quite harmful, or, it would be more beneficial for me as a survivor if you would talk about things this way. And I think sometimes I do try to integrate as much as I can into the interviews, the feedback that I've been given. And then I'll get another email just saying a massive thank you for listening and taking things on board. And at first I think, how am I possibly going to do that? That's really hard. That's like changing like a thing that I don't even realize that I'm doing. But then after a little while, so I think it's got to be great to be heard and know that you've been heard as somebody that may not have been heard for a very, very long time.
Yeah, that's very true. One of the things that I can't change, and it is a stumbling block for some people, is just that I was a pastor. And they were hurt by a pastor, and now, like, the last thing they want to do is hear from a pastor. They assume what I'm going to do is tell them, this is what you should do, this is how you should feel. And so I bent over backwards in my book to speak with a lot of compassion and understanding and admittance of my own weaknesses in that area, things I've done wrong. And so, again, people have thanked me for that. I can't change that I was a pastor, but I can change my approach. And I'm really grateful in the reviews that many people have said, this guy speaks with a lot of compassion. He really speaks with, and as a pastor, I have an insider view too. So that I offer something that a lot of the people that write books about spiritual abuse are outsiders critiquing, but I'm an insider critiquing, and I think it just gives a different perspective.
You wrote this book a while before terms like spiritual abuse and religious trauma were in the mainstream. I think they're in the mainstream now, but I think that's just maybe my echo chamber.
Right, exactly.
And maybe I'm just more familiar with those terms than the general public, but I'm an idealist, so I'm hoping that we're kind of moving in that direction. And in Broken Trust, you do explore the concepts of toxic leadership within churches, and you talk of toxic faith and spiritual abuse. And I wondered if you could just define what those terms mean for you in the book Broken Trust, and if those terms have changed since you wrote that book.
No, they haven't changed. And I think the two terms, toxic faith and spiritual abuse, are very distinct concepts. And I lay out in the book how they're different, and I can do it briefly for you here. Toxic faith is really talked about a lot. I don't know if spiritual abuse is talked about in the Bible, but definitely toxic faith. In fact, I use the book of Acts and Galatians to tell the story of where Paul and Barnabas and Peter were involved in a very toxic situation where the leaders from Jerusalem came down and started telling the people in the church how they needed to live their life. And there's a big argument between Paul and Barnabas and Peter. So that was a problem. But toxic faith is any kind of faith that causes you to trust in what you can do instead of what God can do for you, which the simple word for that is legalism. Now, it's toxic because it puts all kinds of pressure on you to perform in order to please God. And it produces a lot of false guilt and shame, and never brings you any closer to God. I mean, you can hear it in words like when people say things, well, you've got to always do this, or you should do this, or God wants you to do this, or you have to. In fact, it reminds me of many years ago, I was a young man in the church, but I was still cutting my edge in ministry, and I wrote a little pamphlet on how to find God's will. And I shared that pamphlet with one of my elders just to get his feedback, assuming he'd tell me how great it was. And he said he did really like it. He thought it was very helpful. But he said, Remy, you use the word must a lot. Like, you must do this, you must do that, you need to do this, you have to do that. And he said, I just think that's a little too directive. And I said, yeah, but People, if you want to know God's will, you have to do those things. I just didn't understand what he was saying. And it really took me like 20 years to realize how toxic I was in the way that I was trying to, I felt like there are certain hoops that you have to go through in order for you to know God like I know God. And so that's really a good example of toxic faith. But toxic faith is a mindset. And then spiritual abuse is when someone takes that mindset and uses it to control or manipulate other people for their own benefit. Spiritual abuse actually weaponizes toxic faith against people to get them to obey and conform to their leadership.
I want to take a guess and say that you didn't arrive at these types of thoughts and kind of like the musts and the have tos type of terminology on your own. Was that part of conditioning or watching of other people that came before you in leadership positions, or through reading certain people's advice on how to lead a church, or how did that? I'm just interested in how that naturally came around. And then you have this kind of mentor type who tells you, actually, if you think about it a little bit differently, that might help the way you do lead.
Yeah, that's a good question. No one's ever asked me that before. I think so. Basically, how did I transition out of being a toxic person? That's your question.
How you got into it and then out of it.
Well, I got into it just because I think that's the way I was raised, to be a little obnoxiously right all the time. All right. And I knew the way. And then if you would just conform to my way, that you'd live a better life, right? I think a lot of people are like that. How I got out of it, I went through a really hard season in my life, which is another story that I talk about in my other books. About a 7-year season, I'll just call it a breaking wilderness experience. And I think that experience showed me that I wasn't all that I thought I was and put me in a more humble state. And then I started reading different people. So I think I was mentored by some books by more humble people, and I'm totally spacing on who people are, but they're big. Henry Nouwen, for one. I read a lot of Henry Nouwen, and it just gave me a different perspective on the way to treat people.
I love those stories and kind of asking people how those journeys played out for them, because I think it shows how it's possible for each of us to change our mindsets and how we approach things. Say all the time, as somebody that didn't really know much about cults or coercive control before I started this podcast, was definitely one of these really misinformed, unhelpful people that said, well, I would never be in an abusive relationship, or I would never get pulled into a cult. Or why don't you just leave? Why don't you walk away? I definitely was one of those people. And I really admire my own journey in being able to now realize how unhelpful and incorrect that was, and how much further I have to go in becoming somebody that is a little bit more helpful in the way that they think and feel about things. And that has only come from working with survivors. And I think that speaks to how incredible it is to be trusted with people's most vulnerable stories in shaping our own learning journeys. So I just love that your experience is different, but kind of a little bit similar in some aspects as well.
It's, kind of ruins you, though, doesn't it? I mean, once you gain, this is true in life in general. When you gain an insight that others don't have, then you always want the other people to see what you see, and they don't. Like, I'm kind of ruined for sermons now because I don't think pastors realize how much toxic faith is woven into their faith. They don't get up on Sunday morning and say, I'm going to preach a toxic sermon today. They want to help people, but they don't realize, kind of like myself years ago when I said, you must do this and you must do that. They just don't realize how that's been woven into their speaking, and how it shuts people down. It doesn't doesn't release you to receive the message. It kind of shuts you down because you feel like you're being told how to do it. And we just instinctively react against that.
I do hear absolutely what you're saying and how it can feel like an uphill battle sometimes, kind of rolling this massive boulder uphill when you have conversations with people who are like, that's not how I see it. And we're like, but if you could just think about it this way. I do have one listener who emails occasionally. His name is Pastor David, and his emails will always make me really teary. Going to not get teary when I talk about Pastor David. But he always listens to episodes of this podcast and others in preparation for his Sunday services to make sure that he is being as non-spiritually abusive as possible. And I just think that's the most amazing thing in the whole world.
It's really great.
So there are others out there, and I think that's important to remember because otherwise it can feel like very lonely.
And he did start crying.
Yeah, well, I think I just, it just fills me, it just fills my, it fills my little heart up. It makes me feel all warm.
That's great.
What would you say are some common signs that a church or spiritual community might be veering towards coercive or abusive behavior?
Yeah, and I like that word veering because I think that's what often happens. It's a slow drift. Sometimes you think of spiritual abuse as it kind of comes right out of the chute, full bore. But I think the reason we get sucked into any kind of abusive situation, even like a dating situation, when you first meet someone, it's all love and kisses and you think this person's the best in the world. And then over time, they slowly become abusive and controlling and you realize you're trapped. And I think the same thing happens in a church situation. And let me just use the example of the church that I started out talking about, because this guy came in, like I said, he had a great resume. He had a lot of different gifts and talents. And then he had this great recovery program. And I was just reading yesterday how cultic leaders often have some kind of recovery program. And I thought that was interesting because as I reflected on it, I thought, yeah, that's really true. They have like a recovery program to show you how broken you are, which we can all identify with. And they kind of break you down. And then they show you how they can rebuild you to make you into the person you want to be with their special teaching. And that's what happened with this guy. So he had a recovery program, and then he started teaching these teachings on relationships, which, everyone wants better relationships. But then it just got strange, like I said. So over time, those teachings became more and more prominent. And then as he was questioned about it, he just would get defensive, like, hey, I'm the pastor, and I've been to seminary, and it would shut people down. And then, of course, the pastor was seen as he's got this special revelation, and we can't challenge him because he's heard it from God, and who are we to question that? And when this all blew up and the pastor eventually left, and I went in and I knew one of the elders, he'd been elder for the life of the church. And I said to him, how did this happen? I didn't want to accuse him, but, what were you thinking that this could happen and he could be so far off from biblical truth? And you didn't say anything. And he said, Remy, thought he was wrong and I was going to say something, but I looked around and no one else was saying anything. So I thought, well, maybe I'm the wrong one who's wrong. And I just thought, to me, that was so striking that a man who had been a Christian for 30 years and a leader for most of those years could be swept away in this really unbiblical thing.
It's kind of like the power of conformity in one aspect, but then also social proofing. You're looking around and you're thinking, and as somebody that's not in a leadership position, they're probably looking to leadership and thinking, well, if leadership aren't saying anything, then I'm certainly not going to.
Yeah, I refer to it in my book as the conspiracy of silence, because no one wants to say anything. If the insiders, just the way you said, if the insiders aren't saying anything, then the people who are at a distance, they go, well, maybe I'm just not saying, I only come to church once a week or once a month or whatever it is, and it seems a little off, but who am I? So no one's going to listen to me anyways. And so it just continues.
You've touched on some of these with the church that you've just been describing, but is there a particular story or example from your book that particularly highlights the damaging effects of toxic faith on an individual or on a community?
Yeah. Well, the damaging effect of toxic faith is that it pushes you away from God. And it adds to your sense of shame because you're never doing enough. You're never living up to what you think God wants from you. So yeah, I could tell you about a lot of different churches that are highly legalistic, and we've probably all experienced one at some time or the other. But what I think is most important is that we look for the toxic elements in your average church or in your average person, Christian person. For example, how many people feel guilty for not praying enough or not attending church enough? Somehow in those little things, they feel like they've let God down, that they've disappointed God, and they feel bad. And that's toxic faith. Or how many churches preach theologically correct sermons, but suddenly guilt people for not giving enough money or not volunteering enough or not attending
what I was
the church in
thinking.
public. Yeah. And so I was really glad to hear what you said about that pastor that you mentioned, that he listens to your podcast. So just to kind of cleanse himself from that inherent toxicity that we naturally put into everything that we do. So my point is that it's hard to find a person or a church that doesn't have some element of toxic faith. And so we have to always be on the lookout for it. Not only does it distort our view of God, but you project a false concept of God to all the people around you.
And based on your observations and the cases that you've worked with or from your own personal experiences, how do you think spiritual abuse affects relationships within families and communities?
Well, it definitely impacts relationships in a negative way. I mean, what builds relationships is both vulnerability and trust. Those are two things you need if you want a relationship to grow. And there's freedom in that. There's freedom in good relationships. There's freedom to express yourself without feeling judged. You know that you're going to be accepted by that friend or that family member, and they're not going to accept you for what they want you to be. They're just going to accept you for who you are. And that there's a lot of freedom in that. You can just tell them whatever you want to, and you know that you'll still be accepted. But the opposite is true with spiritual abuse. All abuse is about controlling you and manipulating you to conform to someone else's standard. And so you're only going to be accepted by them if you conform to them. And if you don't, you're punished, and then you're stained for it. So the goal isn't for you to express yourself. Their goal for you is to express themselves through you. So it totally puts you in a box, and you're now unable to have a relationship with freedom. So you can imagine what that does to relationships. It's very oppressive and crushing.
Yeah, it's like that stripping of personal autonomy. And it's tough because in order to build a relationship, there needs to be vulnerability and trust, which are two of the things that are immediately exploited by people who are trying to control others. So it's a human nature to want to be vulnerable and to trust. And sometimes those things are taken advantage of by people who are very good at exploiting and manipulating others. And it's hard to discern when somebody is being honest with their motivations and when somebody is being duplicitous. And that's the really tricky part about coercive and controlling behaviour. And that's why it's very unhelpful to say things like that would never happen to me, because all of us are absolutely vulnerable to being controlled by other people.
Yeah, the whole thing of trust. I mean, that's why I called my book Broken Trust, because I think that's really at the essence of what's happening. You go to a church, the typical person goes to a church thinking that, well, this is a God place. This is a place where God is. The leaders must know God well. I assume that they're going to care for me and want the best for me. And then when it turns out that you find out, usually after years, that they haven't been for you, that they've been for themselves. That's a huge break of trust. And that's why it's so traumatic. So when you talk about spiritual abuse, you're talking about trauma. It's something that goes very deep within inside of you.
Yeah. And a lot of the time when people have experienced spiritual abuse and are feeling the impact of spiritual and religious trauma, there's often a crisis of a spiritual crisis. And I wonder how many people you might have worked with who are facing a spiritual crisis and wondering if the best thing for them would be to divorce from their religion or to continue with their faith? Because I have a mixed bag of people that come to speak on the show. Some people have walked away from their faith altogether, and some people have continued to try and rebuild a better relationship with their faith in a safer environment on their own terms. So how do you navigate those waters on helping people to maintain their faith?
Well, that's one of the areas that I try to be super sensitive. And I think maybe that's where when people hear that, like I mentioned before, people hear I'm a pastor, they assume I'm going to want to keep them locked into at least some of their past. And as much as I want them to still be a Christian and still walk with Jesus, I realize that their experience has been so traumatic that might be the farthest thing from their mind. And it might, as you said, might just be very actually repulsive to them. So knowing that they've experienced this trauma, that's not where I think you need to take people. I think you just need to hear their story and appreciate where they're at. And hopefully they can come back to faith. But that's not always the case. And, God knows that. I think God appreciates their pain and where they're at, and he works with them where they're at.
That is one of the most compassionate responses I think I've heard. And I wonder if there were more people with that approach, if it would be somewhat possible for some people to maintain their faith. Of course, I don't know, and I don't want to speak for people, but it makes me wonder if people had that type of reception and that type of support, if maybe it would be different for them. Oftentimes I hear people say, I tried to go to a different church or I tried to go back to church, but it felt familiar to the traumatic experience that I'd had. Maybe in the subtle ways that you've explained, in just the way people speak, with the must-dos and the must-haves and the small things that, the shame and guilt that people might feel from attending certain church services. But what are some initials?
Well, let me no, that's fine. I just, from my own experience, when I went through a very abusive and traumatic experience in a church, I thought I could just go to another church. And like you said, I couldn't. And I thought, well, I'll just give it time. So like 6 months later, my wife and I went back and we still couldn't. And so after a while, we just thought, I felt that here comes the toxic faith. I thought, well, I felt guilty because I wasn't going to church. And I really felt that God was speaking to my heart saying, I want you to take some time away. You need to take some time away. So we didn't go to a church service for 5 years. And then we slowly worked our way back in. And then obviously I ultimately became a pastor. So I went all the way in. But I appreciate what it's like to have that disorienting feeling. And I think the problem, as we've been talking about this, people who've been traumatized and someone comes to them and says, don't lose your faith and you just got to get back in church, and church is where it's, blah, 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 all this Christianese. They're not feeling cared for. They're saying, all you want from me is to conform. There's that conformity again, to conform to your idea of what a religious, spiritual person is. You don't seem to care that I've been traumatized. I need someone to come and just care about me, even if that means, and here's that acceptance, that you're going to accept me even if I reject Jesus. Because if you can't do that, then I don't feel like you truly love me or you truly have compassion for me. And so if you want to help someone in that situation, that's where you need to start. You need to start saying, I'm going to love you even if you reject Jesus. And if you ever come back to Jesus, I'm happy to talk to you about that, but that's not my agenda here.
So beautiful. I think that's really, really, really beautiful, especially when I think about how many people have talked about the difficulty of feeling conditionally loved or conditionally supported within their faith-based community. You have this network of people on the condition that you go to this church, or you have the love of these people on the condition that you follow the rules that the church expects of you. And I think sometimes I wonder if a person who tries to maintain their faith or their relationship with God, if perhaps taking some time away and then feeling that shame and guilt and wondering how you'll be judged by your peers if you decide to go back to church, and you have these toxic faith-based communities that say, well, you haven't been here for X amount of time, or you've been away for this long. So there's that kind of holier than thou mentality that I think might also deter people from maybe trying to go back to church or a faith-based community. I mean, I don't know. I would need other people to tell me whether that's along the right lines or not. So if a person comes to you and they tell their story about experiencing spiritual abuse, what would be some initial steps that you would recommend for that person to recognize what they've experienced and recover from those experiences?
I think I've mentioned this before, but the first thing is just to disengage. And to me, that seems obvious, but I guess I often get pushback on that. Like, no, you can't leave church. You should never leave church. And it's like, like I just said, I left church for 5 years and I didn't go to hell. The opposite happened. I became a full-time pastor. So you can't tell me that leaving church for 5 years is going to do damage to me. You know, when you're on a football field and you're injured, you don't stay in the game. You come out of the game and you sit on a bicycle, or you go into the coach's room and get treatment. You don't stay in the field. And so I think it's important to disengage for the reasons that we've talked about, just to clear your head, to get perspective, and to rethink your faith and what you want it to look like. So I think that's very important. I think after that, it's important to maybe read a book or two or listen to podcasts like yours, just to get the outside perspective. A lot of times when people are in a spiritually abusive situation, they are so locked in, they're kept from hearing other points of view. In fact, those points of view are demonized. Like, those are bad people. We've got the truth. You don't want to listen to other people. So it's important to hear other perspectives, through the podcast and reading the books. And then I think a third thing I would do is to find a counselor that's trained in both trauma and spiritual abuse, to help them walk you through not only the abuse itself, but maybe what set you up for the abuse. And I think that's where I've learned a lot about myself, that just in my past, because how we're just raised in our culture, there's a toxicity in our culture where we think people need to think like we do. So it's easy to conform to that kind of toxic thinking.
It's working alongside survivors and leaders of churches. With your consultancy work, how do you assist leaders in faith-based communities to create healthier, more transparent community environments in all these places you visit around the world?
Yeah. Well, primarily trying to help them just to understand legalism and how natural and common it is to be a part of our language. We just don't see it. So I encourage them to deconstruct their toxic culture, or first to see it, and they don't always see it. But if they could see it, to deconstruct it, try to help them point out, just like that elder did with me years ago, Remy, I think he used the word must a lot, trying to help them to see maybe some areas where there is some toxicity, and then how to cleanse their church from that toxicity. Apostle Paul, he said this in Galatians 5:1. Let me just read it to you. He said, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. And I think that's something that pastors need to keep in their mind, that I'm here as a pastor in this church with these people to help them find freedom, not to have a yoke put on them, constraining them to be like me and to think like me, but to be free to know God and to let God speak to them and direct their life.
I think that's, again, it's just refreshing. I think after so many interviews of talking with people that have experienced just the most heartbreaking spiritual environments, it's very refreshing to have this conversation.
but a little bit unsettling because of how unfamiliar it feels, which is not necessarily, I mean, it's filling me with like, but also a little bit of like existential dread. Like how, I mean, I know the nature of my podcast is to speak to survivors of coercive and controlling behaviour, but yeah, it's kind of unsettling how much we hear the darker stuff and less about the more proactive approach to stopping the darker stuff from happening. Just looking here at your Amazon page. So Broken Trust, a practical guide to identify and recover from toxic faith, toxic church, and spiritual abuse. It's got a ton of ratings on Amazon, and it's got a 4.7 out of 5 stars. And it's also written in Spanish.
It is.
Did you have help translating the book?
I did. Yeah, I had a couple of my Spanish friends from my travels to help me with that.
Has it been helpful for the Spanish-speaking community?
Spanish world has not picked up on it. I'm a little disappointed with that. I thought it would. It has a lot to do with expense of books, I guess, and it has to do with Amazon's availability in some of the South American countries. But I would love for it to reach more people in the Spanish-speaking world. That's where I travel. I'm desperately working hard at speaking Spanish so I can be more conversant.
So would you say that has been maybe one of the challenges that you've faced in spreading the word of the book Broken Trust?
Which is what?
Just the language barrier and the ability for other people to get access to the writing itself.
Yeah. I think the book is in English-speaking world. It's done very well, which is amazing to me because I don't market it. I don't have an agent. I just put it online and people bought it. So that's very gratifying to me. In other countries, that's where there's some difficulty. My Spanish-speaking friend who helped me did most of the translation work. He said, "Remy, this is a really good book and I really like it, but I think pastors are going to have trouble with it." I go, "Really?" He goes, "It's really challenging." And, he's a pastor, so he said, it's kind of threatening because this is kind of how we think and this is how we operate and we don't always see it. So I think a lot of pastors will get defensive. So really, now that you mentioned it, I haven't heard back from many. I'm trying to think if I've heard back from any pastors. All the people that write me are people who have been in a bad church experience.
Pastor David, get in touch with Remy and let him know what you think of his book.
Yeah.
How have church leaders and congregations reacted to your discussions on toxic faith? So we've talked a little bit about what some of your pastor friends might think of the writing, but what have the reactions been from churchgoers, congregants, and people that are part of a faith-based community?
Well, it's not like I go around and speak on Sunday mornings about this. So I don't really have knowledge of that kind of reaction. It's the reaction I get through emails from people that have written the book, or I have a YouTube channel and I've put a few 5-minute or 10-minute clips on there with some ideas from my book, and I get a lot of comments there too. So it's always all very positive. I mean, it's just surprising to me that people can get so locked in, and when they see a video or read a book like mine, and it just blows their mind. I mean, I'm not the only one speaking on these things. So it's kind of just interesting to me that people can get so locked in and not be exposed, and then they see one video and they go, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know that what I'm doing might be wrong, or what might be done to me is wrong."
Does the book and your videos also give advice for loved ones who might suspect that somebody that they care about is being subjected to spiritual abuse?
Yeah, I think, and it's it's been a while since I wrote the book. So I think towards the back of the book, I did address that a little bit, how to do that. And like I said, you have to be really, really patient with people. I've heard through some of the other experts in the field that what you need to do is just listen to people's story and let them tell you why they believe what they believe, rather than you trying to convert them back to whatever it is you want to convert them back to. Just to listen to their story. Tell me why you think this is important. And as they tell their story, often it doesn't make sense even to them. And so I think that's one of the things that I would recommend if you have someone in your life like that, to just be inquisitive, be curious, and not a whiff of judgment. Just like, this is really interesting what you're into. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And why is that important to you?
I think that, combined with a little tidbit I heard from Pat Ryan on find common ground. So just find one thing that you have in common with the other person. And then if you can find one thing that you have in common, even if you have completely opposing religious views, political views, human rights views, whatever it is, if you can find one thing in common, then that establishes a baseline that you can build on. And I think that, combined with what you've just said about having no judgment and just listening, it makes me want to have conversations with more people. 10 years ago, when you were working on this book and putting it out into the world, I don't imagine that there were many websites, YouTube channels, other books. I mean, you've already said that there are only a handful available to purchase on spiritual abuse. Now we've moved on a bit. Are there specific resources or support networks that you recommend to people that have been affected by spiritual abuse, or do we still have a long way to go until that happens?
I was researching this a little bit the other day, just what some of the options are. There was one ministry, I won't mention it, but as I looked at all the stories and the testimonies, it was kind of what we referred to earlier, where people had left their church and they were now looking for something different. That they had totally rejected their faith and they were trying to come up with something fresh. And whereas I appreciate that, I would hope that people would want to be open at some point to come back. And so I think if the counselors in that ministry are against their faith, then you're never the possibility of coming back to faith isn't there. There's a ministry that I've had a little exposure to. It's called Be Emboldened. And they take that different approach where they appreciate how you could reject your faith and they are compassionate. But if you want to come back to faith, they offer a mechanism to find your way back. So that's just one site that I would recommend. It's Be Emboldened, all one word, .com. And then, like I said before, if you're looking for a therapist, I'd encourage that. Make sure that they've got some trauma and spiritual abuse experience.
Mm-hmm. There's also this book on Amazon called Broken Trust.
Yeah.
It's a resource that might help people identify and recover from spiritual abuse.
Hopefully.
How do you think the broader religious community should address the issues of toxic faith and spiritual abuse moving forward? That's a huge question.
Yeah. And I have a short answer, just that, we need to become educated and we need to be open to hearing about it. It's hard. Like my pastor friend, my Spanish speaking pastor friend said, it's hard to hear about it because no one wants to think that they are toxic. No one wants to think that they're abusive, but we're all capable of it and we're capable of doing it and we're capable of receiving it. And so I think it's important to talk about those things and become aware of them.
I can kind of understand why it might feel like a huge undertaking for other people in spiritual leadership positions to read a book like this, because, the Bible is a very old book.
Uh-huh.
Some of these practices are very, very old practices that are embedded in generations of churchgoers, people that are part of faith-based communities, and everything else in the world is moving forward, pretty much everything apart from some religious and spiritual practices. So you're very progressive, I would say, in the way that you approach the way you think about this work. Do you think it's very much mentality of, well, this is how we've always done it, so we don't want to think about how we could do it differently or do it better?
Yeah, I think, I'm saddened to see how sometimes people in the church, especially leadership, are threatened by psychology or, psychological approaches, learning from those institutions what that might bring into our faith experience, because the Bible doesn't have everything. It doesn't teach you all about science. It doesn't teach you all about psychology, or, you can go down the list. It gives you a window into who God is and how we can know him. And so God owns all truth. And if there's truth in psychology, we should apply it to our situation. So I think we can broaden, in a church situation, in a faith experience, we can broaden people's faith experience by helping them understand some psychological things that interrelate. I've always brought that into my teaching. Many people appreciate it. I was at a pastor's conference once, and I was teaching about anger and loss. And the first session I had was very biblically based. And then the second session, I said, now I want to offer some psychological insights about anger into our discussion, and continued on with that workshop. And then we broke for lunch, and someone came up to me at lunch. He said, you shouldn't have talked about the psychological aspect of this. I go, I kind of laughed, like, what do you mean? And he said, yeah, that didn't go over very well. And I thought, that's so sad that these pastors, like, as soon as you say the word psychology, it negates all of what the truth I had to share with them.
Maybe not every person in the room is, you'll never know if what you say rings true with just one person in the room. And I always think that when we're doing the work on talking about coercive and controlling behaviour in any capacity, across any context, with any community of survivors, I think you never know who you're getting through to, or current members of abusive environments. You could just, have that conversation where you say, what's that one thing we have in common? Or tell me your story because I want to hear what you have to say. You just never know. And I think that's hopeful.
Well, it taught me not to use trigger words, so I still teach the same things. I just don't use the word psychology.
Which is like a psychology-based practice in itself.
Yeah, I know.
I love that so much. And you said that you're semi-retired and that some of your work, it does involve you traveling and, kind of coaching and consulting in different countries on how to be less or what would be the opposite of spiritual abuse?
True. Grace and truth and freedom.
And spiritual positivity.
Or generosity. I would say generosity, teaching churches to be generous churches. I think that's a good word to summarize the opposite of abuse.
Do you feel like you have another book in the works, or are you done with the writing now?
I don't know. About every other week I tell my wife the new book that I'm going to write, and then I don't. So there's just so many things. I was telling some people, always ask me, how's retirement? And I said, it's great. I get to do all the things I had to say no to before. And so there's so many things that we're getting to do now, where before we were locked into our weekly schedule. I used to work on a farm, and I felt locked in on the farm because you always had to milk the cows. I tend to tell people that's kind of like what it's like being a pastor, because you're always locked in. You never have a weekend free. And so now we have a lot of time to do the things that we've always had to say no to. Yeah. So writing a book is very intensive, and it gets worse. It starts out really fun because you've got all these great ideas. And by the time, it gets you closer and closer to publishing, it's all about editing. And editing is terrible because you always find one more mistake. And that's the thing that makes me never want to write another book. So if I write another book, it'll be because the heavens opened up and God came down and said I had to do it. But I don't think there's one on my plate for now.
Was it the restrictive timetable of being a pastor that encouraged you to go into semi-retirement, or did you just feel like it was time for you to do other things?
I just think it's healthy. It was the right thing to do. I probably could have stayed there for many, many years if I wanted to. People like me. I was the founding pastor, and church was growing. It was thriving, and everything about it was good. And I guess kind of thing you want to go out on top. But I had a really strong leader as my associate, and I thought he deserved to take over the leadership role. And as I was getting older into my just research shows that younger pastors attract younger people. And I didn't want to lose the younger generation because we had a really nice mix in our church of all ages. And I was afraid that as I got older, the church might start aging out with me. And so I thought, there's lots of things I can do. I don't need to keep doing this. And so that's why I left.
Gosh, I mean, even that is just such a selfless thing to say. It's just so unfamiliar. Unbelievably unfamiliar. Yeah.
Well, it's just good leadership. It's good leadership to leave at a certain point.
Yeah, even in workplaces, I don't think you get a lot of the things we've talked about today. We need more of that in workplaces, sports, in kind of micro communities all around the world, I think. So before we round up today and finish our recording, I wanted to ask you if you had any final thoughts or comments that you wanted to share with people. And I wanted to ask you one final question on what you hope readers take away from Broken Trust and apply in their own lives or their communities.
Yeah, and I think that's a good question because that's probably what, if I had anything else to say, I would just say the same thing in answering your question about my book, because my goal in writing the book, Broken Trust, was to offer people, like it says right in the title or the subtitle, to offer them a practical guide to be able to first recognize toxic faiths and spiritual abuse, but then find the freedom from it. So I really wanted people to feel like I was their companion, I was their guide, to take them through the kind of the landmines of their situation and get them into a safe place. I think a lot of the books on spiritual abuse are more objective, and they talk about what it is, which is great. That's fine. I talk about what it is as well. But I guess it's the pastor in me that wanted to say, here, let me guide you through this. Let me give you some advice on should I confront these leaders, these abusive leaders, or should I just leave? That's a big question. And so I talk about those different things. And then I talk about, that's when I bring in my other books too. I talk about the anger that you feel towards the abuse. I talk about the shame that you took on as a result of it. I talk about the loss as well. So I kind of take you through some of those emotional experiences and how to process them. And then what to do afterwards. Is it okay to not go to church for a while? So I talk about the recovery process too. So that's me being a pastor guiding you through these landmines. And my hope is that, like I said, that somewhere along the line, people might be able to reclaim their faith. As you suggested, it's easy to abandon your faith when you've had one of these traumatic experiences, and a lot of people do. Happens all the time. I don't want to force people, as I've said, to come back to faith, but if they want to, if there's any inkling there, because I really believe that God is real. I really believe that God loves us. I really believe that God wants the best for us. And I'm getting choked up. And if I can help them to reestablish that relationship, that would be the best of all things. So that's why I write the book, and that's why I do what I do.
Well, this has just been such a wonderful and warm and refreshing conversation today. I so appreciate you reaching out to me and sending across all of the information that you did and coming on here and just being so candid and compassionate and offering us an insight into all of the things that you've learned and your personal journey as well. The accountability is not something that is often addressed. People don't often acknowledge moral injury and things that are difficult for us, I think, to face on an individual basis. A lot of kind of work on introspection it's really difficult, but you're so open with your experiences and in how you want to help others. And this has just been such a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, it's been a joy just talking to you as well. I love your personality.
I'm going to put a link to Broken Trust in the episode description. And if any of the listeners grab a copy and have a read, do let me know what you think, because I always love having conversations with people about their thoughts and feelings on books and memoirs that we discuss with the authors on the podcast. And also don't forget to leave a review or a rating for Remy. And if you go to a local library, request a copy of it there if there isn't already one in stock.
Appreciate that.
And if you can find a local bookstore to purchase the book from, then of course, do that instead.
Great. That'd be great.
So thank you so much for your time today, Remy, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much, you too, Kacey.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.